You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. Hello there. Today's episode is a little bit different because instead of hearing from one of our storytellers, we're going to take a few episodes to talk about the upcoming PCA General Assembly. As you may or may not know, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America is a denomination-wide gathering that happens every year, usually in June. This year's General Assembly will take place the week of June 23rd, and it'll be in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'll be traveling to Chattanooga for General Assembly so that I can observe and explain the business that happens there. And I do that specifically for lay people in the PCA and others who may be interested in following along. General Assembly is live streamed, so even if you aren't able to attend, you can watch the main meetings of General Assembly on YouTube. And in the weeks leading up to General Assembly, these episodes will help you to understand some of the things that will happen during that week. The proposals that have been submitted for consideration, they're called Overtures, as well as some relevant background on PCA church government and other things to provide the context of these overtures and what they are proposing to do. A podcast is a great medium for explaining things, but I know it can be tricky to follow all the overture numbers and the specific language of each one. So in the show notes, I will also link to two other resources that can help you out. First, I've written up a simple description of each of the overtures in a post, so you can refer back to it and match the numbers with the ideas. And second, during the month of June, Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew hosts a Facebook group specifically for lay people to be able to ask questions all about the overtures and General Assembly as a whole and how that all works. So you can search Facebook for Presbyterian Pew Guide to the 2025 PCA General Assembly, or you can look in the show notes and there will be a link there. The thing I love about this group is that there is no assumption that you already know anything about how the PCA works or how General Assembly works. There are no dumb questions. So you can come and ask anything that you need to know in order to understand what's happening and what you can expect. So this year, there actually have been 50 overtures submitted to the General Assembly. One of them is withdrawn, so there's only 49, but that's a lot. And rather than going through them all in number order, what I've done is I've grouped them by topic or by type so we can discuss similar overtures together. So here's a little overview of what I'll be covering across these episodes. First, we'll talk a little bit about some business that has carried over from last year and what's likely to happen with that this year. We'll talk about some overtures that change the boundaries of presbyteries. And then we'll talk about overtures that are requesting studies or study committees or pastoral letters or encouragement. Then we'll take a look at a couple of overtures that have to do with the directory for worship, followed by some overtures that relate to officers and the ordination of officers. Next, we'll look at a group of overtures that relate to membership vows and examining children for membership. The next group of overtures is somewhat of a miscellaneous catch-all category that relates to various PCA committees and agencies. And then finally, we'll look at a large number of overtures related to the rules of discipline. The rules of discipline is the section of the Book of Church Order that covers things like investigations and trials and censures. My primary goal as we talk through these overtures is really just to help you understand what the overtures are all about. In some cases, I will share some personal perspective or my opinion, but as we head towards General Assembly, and especially during the week of General Assembly itself, there may be new and persuasive arguments that come up for any of these overtures. Just take my opinions as my current thoughts at the time that I'm recording this, and I reserve the right to change my mind as I hear more or read something new. I also really encourage you to read and listen broadly. As LeVar Burton would say on Reading Rainbow, you don't have to take my word for it. So in the article that I linked to in the show notes, I've also included links to other resources. There are 4 different documents. One of them that I especially recommend and have found helpful is by 2 pastors, Jared Nelson and Scott Edberg, and they do a really good job of just outlining what each overture essentially does. And they also list what potential objections or factors for discussion might be. They do a really good job, I think, in my opinion, of being fair and trying to represent the issues and the potential concerns as well as they can. And then there are 3 other documents that are written by men who have lots and lots of experience with the PCA and General Assembly, and they are giving their recommendations of how they would advise pastors and elders to vote on those issues. I've also linked to a few podcasts. There's always plenty of those. So if you want to hear other voices, which again, I highly recommend, you can check the article that I've linked, and very near the bottom, there are links to all of those resources. Okay, so let's begin with business that started last year that will be carried over to this year. One thing to keep in mind is that changes to the Book of Church Order take a 3-step process. So they have to first be approved in one General Assembly, and then in the interim between General Assemblies, they have to be ratified by at least 2/3 of the presbyteries, and then they have to be approved again at the following General Assembly in order for the change to become an official change to the Book of Church Order. So last year, at the 2024 General Assembly, there were 4 overtures to change the Book of Church Order that were passed at that General Assembly. All 4 of those have also been ratified by a large majority of the presbyteries, like significantly more than 2/3. So they are up for one final vote at this year's General Assembly. This vote actually takes place during the very first business session of General Assembly, which will be on Tuesday evening, and it's during the stated clerk's report. One thing that's also helpful to know is that once overtures have passed the first General Assembly, overtures that have to do with changing the Book of Church Order, they are then labeled as items rather than overtures, so that when they come back to General Assembly for the second go-round, they won't be confused with current overtures. So when you hear a discussion of items, those are last year's overtures that were approved last year and by 2/3 of the General Assembly and are now up for final approval. So here are the 4 items that we'll be looking at during the stated clerk's report this year. Item 1 relates to examining the Christian character of ministers transferring into a presbytery from another presbytery, and it includes such things as a requirement that any reason that a transfer is denied would be communicated to his current or sending presbytery. Item 2 adds specific language requiring the examination of a man's personal character and family management when he's transferring into a presbytery. Item 3 expands the opportunity for someone who is accused of something in a PCA trial to have representation. It has always been the case that they could have representation, but this item expands the pool of people who are eligible to provide that representation. So it was already the case that any member in good standing could represent someone in a trial before that church's session. So if there's a trial before the session, any member in good standing in that church could represent the accused person. Now, it's also the case that if there's a trial before a presbytery, anyone who's a member in good standing in any church in that presbytery can represent the accused person. And also, if there's a trial before the Standing Judicial Commission of the General Assembly, which is the PCA's highest court, anyone who is a member in good standing in any PCA church may provide representation for that person. Item 4 provides for the handling of complaints that are raised during a judicial trial, and it specifically provides for those complaints to be handled after the trial. This is to avoid trials and the business of the trials being delayed and prolonged unnecessarily by complaints that may arise. And that's not to say that these complaints can never be handled, but they will be delayed and handled after the business of the trial is finished. All four of these are, I think, good and helpful changes. I'm glad that they've been proposed and that they've passed one General Assembly and the presbyteries. I think it's unlikely that there's going to be any serious debate about these issues, but we could always be surprised. Another item that carries over from last year is the discussion of the book Jesus Calling. So last year, there was an overture that was proposed to create a study committee on the book. That overture was significantly amended in the Overtures Committee, and instead of asking for a study committee, it instead required Mission to the World, which is the PCA's mission agency, and the Committee on Discipleship Ministries, which is the PCA's publishing and resource curation organization. It required those two entities to report on any responsibility they held for the publication of this book. CDM's inclusion is because they are the resource curation wing of the PCA. MTW's inclusion was because the author of the book was an MTW missionary and connected to MTW at the time that she was writing the book. MTW was required simply to respond if it had any connection to or responsibility for the publication of this book. The request to CDM was a little more thorough. They were asked, in addition to responding to any connection they might have, to also respond more about the book and to give somewhat of an analysis of the book. Both of those committees have written their response. They're not public at this point, so I haven't seen them. I don't know what they say, but those responses will be reviewed by the Committee of Commissioners on Mission to the World and on Committee for Discipleship Ministries. And then those responses would be presented during the reports of those committees of commissioners on the floor of General Assembly. Okay, so let's move on into talking about this year's overtures. So new things that are coming to the General Assembly this year. First of all, every year there are usually some requests to change presbytery boundaries, and we have a handful of those this year. Overtures 2, 17, 20, 28, 36, 45, and 46 all contain requests to change the boundaries of various presbyteries in the PCA. And just as a side note, Overture 21 was also a presbytery boundary request, but it was withdrawn by the presbytery. I don't know the backstory behind that, but if you're wondering why you don't hear anybody talking about Overture 21, that's why. So all of these proposed changes come from the presbyteries involved. There's nothing that appears to be controversial about any of them. That's generally true. Presbytery boundary changes have to do with geography and logistics, such as maybe let's change the boundaries so this one church is included in a presbytery that has other churches closer to it, or maybe we're going to change the boundaries so we can more evenly distribute churches between presbyteries. These are not issues of gerrymandering or anything like that. It's often, like I said, geographic, logistic changes. So all overtures that have to do with changing presbytery boundaries are referred to Mission to North America, which is the PCA's domestic missions and essentially church planting organization. And so they will be voted on during the M&A Committee of Commissioners report on the floor of General Assembly. And there have also been quite a few overtures submitted this year that request some type of study, either a study committee or a pastoral letter or an overture of pastoral encouragement. Some of these relate directly to the topic of Christian nationalism, which has been gaining attention in reform circles especially. Overtures 3, 4, and 47 all ask the General Assembly to form a study committee on Christian nationalism. The language of why they're requesting this and the actual proposal of what exactly this committee will be formed to do, they all vary slightly, but they're aimed at the same general topic. And one thing that's necessary when there's a formation of a study committee is to provide a way for this work to be paid for. So the estimate of these overtures was that the cost would be about $10,000 a year. So $10,000 if it met for 1 year, and then perhaps more if they needed to continue to meet in subsequent years. And all of the presbyteries that have submitted these overtures have pledged some portion of that support. So presumably, if any one of these three overtures were to be passed, these presbyteries, even if it wasn't their overture that was passed, presumably they have some money in their budget that they would be willing to contribute. And when you add up those pledges, that comes to a combined total of $8,500, at least for the first year. That's already a significant portion of the $10,000. So that could potentially be persuasive that, yes, study committees are expensive, but a good portion of the money has already been pledged. Overture 48 is a slight variation on that. It requests an ad interim committee, but a committee that would write a pastoral letter on Christian citizenship and church-state relations. So this overture has been presented as a cheaper, simpler alternative to a study committee on Christian nationalism. However, its focus is much narrower. And it's looking for simply a pastoral letter. So we're talking maybe a one-pager, as opposed to a full study committee and a study committee report on Christian nationalism. Similar to the kind of language that we heard in defense of federal vision, folks in reform circles sometimes argue that Christian nationalism is well within the bounds of traditional reform teaching. And they may point to something like the original version of the Westminster Confession, which does have a different approach to the relationship between church and state than our current American version does, since the Westminster Confession was originally developed at the behest of the English government in pursuit of a basis for a state church. However, current conversations about Christian nationalism do go further than arguing for the type of establishmentarianism that we see in the early Westminster Confession, and sometimes verge into ethnocentrism and white nationalism. In my opinion, establishing a clear understanding of these terms and how they converge or diverge from biblical and Reformed doctrine is really important. This might not be a problem that all corners of the PCA are facing. There just are some regions that are experiencing more of a pull towards this ideology than others. So some folks may not see this as pressing a problem, as perhaps the presbyteries who have submitted these overtures. But much as we saw in the days of combating the federal vision heresy, I believe that allowing those with experience and wisdom a time to gather and discuss and deliberate these issues in the context of relationship will result in a report that can be referenced as we continue to navigate these waters, much as we're still able to point to our denominational paper on federal vision. Okay, apart from the topic of Christian nationalism, here are some other requests for studies or study committees. Overture 11 requests the sessions and presbyteries of the PCA study the risks and benefits of incorporating Bitcoin into their balance sheets, and as they are able to share the results of their research into this matter with the denomination more broadly. So in lieu of a formal study committee, this would just be asking local groups to study this. Maybe they write something on it. Maybe there are articles that they could publish or share with others. Overture 26 asks the General Assembly to form a study committee to revise the directory for worship so that it can become fully constitutionally binding. And I will talk about this one in a little more depth in just a moment when we get into looking at two other overtures that relate to the directory for worship. Overture 27 proposes a study committee to solicit input from sessions and presbyteries about ways the permanent committees and agencies of the General Assembly can streamline or optimize spending and make better use of their resources. Overture 49 requests the General Assembly to form a study committee on AI and specifically how it might be used in application in the church or Christian vocation. Overture 50 is a little interesting. It's not a request for a study committee, nor is it a request for a pastoral letter, but rather it is a self-contained encouragement. Overture 50 is asking the General Assembly to pass this as kind of pastoral encouragement for discernment and compassion in the way that we interact with immigrants. There's a bit of a backstory to why this is being proposed, and again, I'll discuss that further when we get into a conversation about some of the overtures that relate to specific PCA agencies and permanent committees. Now let's talk a little bit about overtures that are related to the directory for worship. So the first two sections of the Book of Church Order, which are called the Form of Government and the rules of discipline are constitutionally binding. That means churches and church leaders are required to follow them and could potentially be cited or brought up on charges if they don't follow those sections of the Book of Church Order. The third section, which is called the Directory for Worship, is only partially constitutionally binding. Most of it is not. However, chapters 56, 57, and 58, which have to do with the sacraments, and especially they include the vows that, for example, parents might take when they baptize their child, or the vows that members take when they join the church. Those sections are constitutionally binding. And also there's one paragraph in chapter 59 about marriage that is constitutionally binding, but the rest of the Directory for Worship is not. And there has been a lot of conversation recently about moving to make all of the Directory of Worship or more parts of the Directory of Worship constitutionally binding. And this is primarily based on plausible evidence that the founders of the PCA did intend for the Directory of Worship to eventually be revised and adopted as constitutionally binding. As you can imagine, developing your own Book of Church Order for a brand new denomination and getting all of the parts approved is a lot of work. So what eventually took place was that they approved the first two sections as constitutionally binding. The Directory for Worship at that time was given as helpful advice with the intent that it might eventually become constitutionally binding. So we talked a moment ago when we were discussing study committees that Overture 26 requests the General Assembly to form a study committee to revise the entire Directory of Worship for full constitutional status. And passing this overture, we need to be clear, the passing of the overture would only result in the formation of the study committee and the resulting report from the study committee. It would not actually make their proposed revisions constitutionally binding. So that would have to become another vote in the preceding General Assembly or perhaps the one after that. So some have raised questions about, okay, what if we spend all this money on a study committee and the study committee proposes all of their revisions towards the goal of making it constitutionally binding, and then the next General Assembly says, no, we don't want this section to be constitutionally binding. Would that be a big outlay of time and energy without the end result being guaranteed? Maybe we should determine whether we want the Directory for Worship to be constitutionally binding. On the other hand, you could argue if the General Assembly approves this study committee, perhaps that is a vote of good faith if they do intend to eventually constitutionalize the Directory for Worship. It is important to note that there is an anticipation that amendments will need to be made before it could be constitutionalized. That brings us to our next overture. Overture 5 seeks to grant full constitutional status, not to the whole Directory for Worship, but just a few chapters, chapters 60 through 63. And these chapters cover the following topics: the visitation of the sick, the burial of the dead, days of fasting and thanksgiving, and Christian life in the home. So there's not a whole lot that's super controversial in these chapters. However, it can be tricky when we're going from something that is not constitutionally binding to something that is, to look at each of the individual passages and consider what would happen if this became constitutionally binding. Just as a random example, in the discussion of the burial of the dead, there are 3 things that are to be included in a funeral service, and one of those is the singing of a hymn or a song. So what if a family says they don't want singing to be included in the funeral service? Would the pastor be brought up on charges if he said, okay, we don't have to sing a hymn? So perhaps that's something that might need to be amended if it's going to become constitutionally binding, or would need to be listed as an optional, or perhaps folks do want that to be constitutionally binding. But all of those things would need to be considered when moving from a Directory of Worship that's used as guidance towards a Directory of Worship that is now constitutionally binding. Overture 12 proposes to amend Book of Church Order, Chapter 58, Paragraph 5, to specify that only officers of the church may distribute the Lord's Supper. Now, we have to parse the language here a little bit, because sometimes people confuse distributing the Lord's Supper with administering the Lord's Supper. The Book of Church Order is already clear. And again, Chapter 58 is one of the sections of the Directory of Worship that is already constitutionally binding. So it is already a constitutional requirement that only teaching elders, that is, pastors, Only teaching elders can administer the Lord's Supper. So, for example, if there are no ordained teaching elders in your church on a given Sunday, maybe your pastor's sick or he's on vacation, there cannot be a Lord's Supper. Only an ordained teaching elder or a honorably retired teaching elder can administer the Lord's Supper, preside over the sacrament. However, the Book of Church Order does not specify who may distribute the elements of the Lord's Supper that a teaching elder has presided over. And churches do this in a lot of different ways. So, for example, in our church, our pastor administers the Lord's Supper, and then we all get out of our seats, walk down to the front, take the elements, go back to our seats, and partake together. So no one is really distributing the elements to us. In other churches, perhaps they have people who walk down the aisles and pass trays that go down the rows. Perhaps they have folks who stand in the front to hold trays that people come down to. There could be a variety of different ways that's done. So this overture is seeking to restrict that distribution of the elements to only officers of the church. So not only elders, but elders or deacons. I'm not sure that I find the reasoning behind this overture to be persuasive. A good deal of the whereas statements or the rationale for this change, they seem to blur categories. So, for example, one argument is that only officers should administer the elements because only the officers know if someone is under church discipline. However, that actually would be a distinction between the elders, the session of the church, and everybody else, not a distinction between the officers and everybody else, since the deacons are not part of the judicial business of the church. Another argument is that since there is historic precedent for only officers to distribute the elements, there would need to be a positive scriptural command in order to allow lay people to distribute the elements. First of all, if we're going to make an argument that there is some kind of historic precedent, it actually would be a historic precedent that only elders would distribute the elements, not that elders and deacons have historically distributed the elements. But we need to keep in mind further that this actually isn't an overture that seeks to allow lay people to hand out trays of elements. It's an overture that seeks to prohibit it. So I don't know why we would need a positive scriptural command in order to refrain from prohibiting something that is not currently prohibited. And finally, this overture argues that allowing lay people to stand in front of the church would confuse people about the distinction between ordained and unordained people. It seems like this concern could simply be overcome by some explanation by the church leaders without too much difficulty, in the same way that a pastor could explain that this pianist who is up here at the front of the church every Sunday is not actually an officer of the church, but is just serving in her capacity as a pianist and using her gifts to glorify God. I know that is a lot to take in one podcast episode, and we have a lot more to go in future episodes. So be sure to check the article that's linked in the show notes and or join the Facebook group if you'd like to be able to ask questions. So in the next episode, we will begin with overtures that address church officers and ordination. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.